My daughter-in-law, Clara, served me with a court order to have me declared incompetent and seize my house. The thick paper trembled in my hand, not from the slight breeze coming through the screen door, but from the sudden ice that had formed in my own veins. My fingers, gripping the edge of the document, had gone white. Her name was right there, next to my son's, Clara and Mark Vance, petitioners. My name, Eleanor Vance, was listed below, under a much colder title, respondent. I am 82 years old, and in a single moment I had been demoted from mother to a problem that needed solving. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know about the quiet legacy my husband had left me, or the names of the men he had shaped. They didn't know about the name hidden in my files, a name that could undo everything they were. If they had only known what they had just thrown away. To understand why, on a gray Tuesday morning, a Superior Court judge would stand up from his bench for a woman in a 20-year-old dress, you need to understand who I really am. It begins, as most things do, with love. My husband Robert was a history professor at the local university, a man of quiet habits and loud thoughts. People saw him as gentle, a bit absent-minded, a creature of tweed jackets with worn leather elbows and a perpetual dusting of chalk on his shirt cuffs. He smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, a scent that still clings to the chairs in his study. That was the man the world saw. The man I knew was a giant. He had a mind that saw the architecture of history, the deep structures of law that held society together or allowed it to crumble. He called his real work, his legal scholarship, a little side project, the way other men might talk about building model ships in the basement. He was modest to a fault. We lived in this house, the one Clara wanted to gut, for 54 years. It's a small brick house with a porch swing Robert and I installed the summer I was pregnant with Mark. The porch steps have been repaired so many times that each one is a different shade of weathered wood, a timeline of our lives told in lumber. Robert and I bought it with the money we'd saved from my job as a school librarian and his meager teaching salary. We had nothing, but we had the quiet joy of building a life from scratch. Our home wasn't a display of wealth, it was a container for our life. Every scratch on the floorboards, every water ring on the coffee table was a story. Robert's side project was conducted under a pseudonym, Juris. He would write long, dense essays on constitutional law and legal theory, and I would be his first reader and his editor. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a red pen while he paced, untangling his complex thoughts into prose that was as clear and strong as a steel beam. "Is it clear, Ellie?" he would always ask. "Does it make sense to a librarian? If it doesn't, it's just academic noise." I typed every manuscript, managed his correspondence with the handful of law reviews that published his work. We were a team. Over the years, Juris developed a reputation in the highest legal circles as a thinker of profound and startling originality. Young law students and even sitting judges would write to the P.O. box we maintained, sending questions, arguments, and sometimes just letters of pure admiration. Robert answered every single one. He believed that mentoring was a sacred duty. We never told anyone, not even Mark. It was our secret, our quiet game. The money he made from it, which was never much, he invested with the same patient, scholarly approach he applied to everything. He'd read obscure financial journals, looking for undervalued companies with solid foundations, what he called good bones. He'd invest a few $100s here, 1,000 there. "It's for a rainy day, Ellie," he'd say, tucking the stock certificates into a simple wooden box he'd made in his workshop. It was the same box where he kept his most prized possession, a first edition copy of the Federalist Papers. Mark grew up in this world of quiet love and intellectual rigor. He was a sweet boy, quick to laugh, with his father's eyes and my practical nature. I remember one summer afternoon. He must have been 7. He fell and scraped his knee badly while chasing a stray cat. He came into the house, face streaked with tears, holding his bleeding leg. I cleaned it and bandaged it, and he sat on my lap on the porch swing, his small body heavy and warm against me. He fell asleep there, his tear-damp cheek pressed to my shoulder. For years, that was the feeling I associated with being a mother, the absolute trusting weight of my child, finding safety in my arms. Then Mark went to college and met Clara. The first time he brought her home, she walked into our living room and her eyes did a quick cold scan. I saw it, the appraisal, the faint, almost imperceptible curl of her lip as she took in our worn furniture, my collection of chipped ceramic birds on the mantelpiece, the faded floral wallpaper. She smelled of expensive perfume, a sharp floral scent that seemed to take up all the air in the room. "Oh, Mark," she said, her voice a smooth, polished stone. "Your mother's home is so cozy." There it was, the first of 1,000 cuts. Cozy was her word for small, old, and valueless. She came from a different world, or rather, she was desperate to. I learned later, in a rare moment of drunken vulnerability at their engagement party, that her family had once had money. Her father owned a successful chain of hardware stores, but he made a bad investment and lost everything. They went from the country club to a cramped apartment, and the shame of it, the social humiliation, had branded her. People we'd known our whole lives would cross the street to avoid my mother, she slurred, her eyes hard and bright. I swore that would never, ever happen to me. I understood her then. I understood her hunger, her fear. I just never imagined I would become the person she would feed to it. They got married a year later. It was a lavish affair, far beyond what they could afford. Clara wanted a statement wedding. "It's an investment in our future, Eleanor," she explained, as if I were a child. "The people we invite will be Mark's future clients." The venue alone cost more than Robert and I had paid for this house. They didn't have the money, of course, so they came to us. "Mom," Mark began, unable to meet my eye. Clara placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "What Mark is trying to say, Eleanor, is that we need a little help with the deposit for the venue. Just a loan, of course." "A loan. It's always called a loan." The amount was $30,000. It was a significant portion of our savings. Robert and I had lived frugally our entire lives. That money was our security, our buffer against the uncertainties of old age. "Of course," I said, looking at my son's hopeful, anxious face. Robert just nodded, his expression unreadable. He wrote the check that night. That was the first entry in a ledger I never intended to keep. Wedding venue deposit, $30,000. 2 years later, they wanted to buy a condominium. It was in a new, gleaming glass tower downtown with a concierge and a rooftop pool. Clara talked about it endlessly, dropping the names of the influential neighbors they would have, but they were short on the down payment. "It's the market, Mom," Mark said over the phone. "If we don't get in now, we'll be priced out forever." Clara got on the extension. "Eleanor, think of it as helping us build equity. It's for your future grandchildren." The down payment they needed was $150,000. It was nearly all of my and Robert's personal savings, the money we had put aside over 40 years. Our what if fund. What if the roof leaks? What if the car dies for good? What if one of us gets sick? Robert was retired by then, his pension modest. My librarian's pension was even smaller. This was the money that let us sleep at night. I remember looking at Robert after the phone call. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, the one with the permanent imprint of his body. He looked tired. "They're our family, Ellie," he said, his voice soft. And that was that. I transferred the money the next day. Condo down payment, $150,000. The requests kept coming, smaller but more frequent. A new car when Mark's was no longer projecting the right image. A bridge loan when Mark wanted to leave his firm and start his own consulting business. Clara, a brand consultant, needed capital for her own venture. Each request was framed as an opportunity, an investment, a final push that would guarantee their success. Each time I'd feel a stone form in my stomach, but I'd look at my son and I'd say, yes, business loan. Mark, $75,000. Business loan, Clara, $50,000. European vacation for networking, $15,000. The grand total, not including the countless small $5,000 emergencies, was $270,000. It was a number that felt abstract, unreal. It was the sum of our quiet life, of skipped vacations and patched up clothes and Robert driving the same car for 15 years. And it was gone. Robert passed away 3 years ago. It was quiet, like he was. A heart attack in his sleep. The grief was a physical weight, a constant pressure behind my ribs that made it difficult to breathe. The house suddenly felt enormous, hollowed out. Mark and Clara were there, of course. Clara organized the funeral with terrifying efficiency, choosing the most expensive casket, the most prestigious funeral home. He deserves the best, Eleanor, she said, squeezing my arm. We have to show people how much he was respected. I knew Robert would have wanted a simple pine box and a few words in our garden, but I was too tired to fight. After the funeral, Clara started talking about my situation. Eleanor, this house is just too big for you, she said one afternoon, standing in my kitchen. She ran a finger over the countertop, then looked at it as if expecting to see dust. The upkeep must be a nightmare, and the stairs. At your age. I manage, I said quietly. Of course you do. You're so stoic. But Mark and I worry. We think it would be best if you sold it and moved into a nice assisted living facility. There's a lovely one near us. It's like a resort. My house, this house that held every memory I treasured. Sell my house. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. I'm not leaving my home, Clara. Her smile was tight, a thin, sharp line. We're just thinking of you, she said. But her eyes were calculating the square footage. The week before he died, Robert had been quiet, more so than usual. He sat with me on the porch swing one evening, holding my hand. His hand felt frail, the skin like paper over bone. Ellie, he said, looking out at the fading light, if anything ever happens to me, everything you need is in the box, for when you need it. Don't talk like that, Robert, I whispered, my throat tight. He squeezed my hand. Just remember, the box. I didn't understand then. I thought he was talking about the stock certificates, the money. I didn't realize he was leaving me ammunition. And that brings me back to the court order. I sat there in the silence of my kitchen, the official paper cool against my skin. I read the words again. Due to advanced age and observed cognitive decline, a danger to herself and her own financial interests. Petitioner Mark Vance, her son, and his wife Clara Vance seek conservatorship, including the disposition of her primary residence. Disposition of my primary residence. Such a clean, sterile phrase for taking my life from me. They had finally done it. They had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a final asset to be liquidated. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, began to shift. The grief and the accommodating softness hardened into something cold and clear. It felt like a physical transformation, a straightening of my spine. The fog of sadness lifted, replaced by a crystalline, righteous anger. I had given them everything, my money, my support, my silence, and in return they had decided I was no longer competent enough to exist in my own home. I stood up from the kitchen table. My legs felt steady for the first time in months. I walked into Robert's study, the air still thick with his memory. I went to the bookshelf and took down the simple wooden box he had made. It was heavier than I remembered. I placed it on his desk and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on top of the old, leather-bound Federalist Papers, was his address book and a single, crisp business card. It read, David Chen, Attorney at Law, Sterling and Croft, LLP. Below the name in Robert's familiar scrawl was a note, Juris's boy. The best of them. I picked up the phone, my hand no longer trembling. It was time to open the box. The offices of Sterling and Croft were on the top 3 floors of a skyscraper that glittered in the afternoon sun. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and glass, and the silence was punctuated only by the soft, expensive clicks of heels on the floor. I felt small and out of place in my charcoal gray dress and my canvas tote bag with a faded museum logo from a trip Robert and I took the year Mark was born. The air smelled of money, a clean, crisp scent like new paper, mixed with leather and strong coffee. The receptionist looked me up and down, her expression a carefully constructed mask of politeness. May I help you? I have an appointment with Mr. David Chen, I said. My voice sounded thin in the cavernous space. Your name? Eleanor Vance. She typed my name into her computer, her perfectly shaped eyebrows rising a fraction of an inch. Mr. Chen is expecting you. 34th floor. David Chen was younger than I expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with a kind face and intelligent eyes behind stylish dark-rimmed glasses. He stood up as I entered his office, which had a wall of glass overlooking the city. Mrs. Vance, he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm and warm. Please sit down. Can I get you some coffee? Tea? Tea would be lovely, thank you, I said, sinking into a leather chair that was so soft it felt like it was sighing. He poured the tea himself, his movements precise and graceful. He sat opposite me, a yellow legal pad and a pen on the desk between us. He was all business. My secretary said your call was urgent. You mentioned a conservatorship petition? I pushed the document Clara had served me across the polished surface of his desk. He picked it up and read, his expression neutral. He was silent for a long time, his eyes scanning the pages. The only sound was the faint hum of the city far below. When he finished, he laid the papers down carefully. This is aggressive, he said, his voice measured. They're alleging cognitive decline, inability to manage your affairs. Is there any basis for these claims, Mrs. Vance? I am 82 years old, Mr. Chen. I am sometimes forgetful. I don't know how to use a smartphone, but I am not incompetent. I see. He tapped his pen on the legal pad. And the petitioners are your son and daughter-in-law. What is their relationship with you like? I took a breath. I have given them $270,000 over the last 10 years. Mr. Chen's eyebrows shot up. This time it wasn't a fractional movement. 270,000? It was my husband's and my life savings. He wrote the number down on his pad. He circled it. And this house they want to dispose of. Do you have a mortgage? No. My husband and I paid it off in 1988. He wrote that down too. So it's a wholly owned asset. He looked at me, a new light in his eyes. It was a look of professional assessment, but there was something else there too, a flicker of sympathy. Mrs. Vance, this is not about your well-being. This is a financial maneuver. They want the house. I know, I said. We can fight this. We'll need a medical evaluation from a geriatric specialist to counter their claims. We'll need to document your financial history. It will be an uphill battle. They're using your age against you, he paused. It can also be expensive. I reached into my canvas tote bag and took out the wooden box. I placed it on his desk. The simple, unvarnished wood looked stark and out of place amidst the chrome and glass. What's this? He asked, a note of curiosity in his voice. My husband was Robert Vance, I said. He told me to find you if I ever needed help. He called you Juris's boy. David Chen froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the box, stopped in midair. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The professional mask fell away, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. Juris? He whispered, the name a breath of air. Your husband was Juris? Yes, I said. I was his editor. He sank back into his chair, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. The sharp lawyer was gone, and in his place was a young man looking at a ghost. My God, he said, his voice full of awe. I wrote to him when I was in law school. I was struggling with an interpretation of the Commerce Clause for a paper. I sent a letter to the P.O. box at the back of the Harvard Law Review. I never expected a reply. He looked at me, his eyes shining. He wrote me back a 4-page, single-spaced, typewritten letter that completely dismantled my argument, but did it so brilliantly, so kindly, that it didn't feel like a criticism. It felt like a gift. It changed everything for me. It's why I became a lawyer. That letter, it's framed in my study at home. He looked at the box, then back at me. A slow smile spread across his face. Eleanor, he said, using my first name for the first time, I think we can do better than just fight this. I think we can end it. He opened the box. Inside, on top of the book, were the stock certificates Robert had collected over the years, and underneath them a thick bundle of letters tied with a simple string. They were the letters from the law students, the professors, the judges, all addressed to juries, all answered in Robert's precise academic hand. And on the very top of the pile was a more recent statement from an investment firm. Mr. Chen picked it up. His eyes widened as he read the number at the bottom. He read it again as if he couldn't believe it. He looked at me, his expression one of utter astonishment. Eleanor, he said, his voice barely a whisper, do you know what these investments are worth today? I have no idea, I said honestly. Robert handled all of it. He handed me the statement. I had to put on my reading glasses to see the number. It had so many commas. $4,782,119.54. $4,782,119. The paper slipped from my fingers. A stone didn't form in my chest. It felt like the one that had been living there for 3 years simply dissolved. I felt light. I realized I had stopped breathing, and I took a deep, shuddering breath. All those years, living so carefully, patching Robert's jackets, making soup from leftovers, thinking we were just comfortable. We weren't comfortable. We were rich. Robert, my quiet, unassuming Robert, had built a fortune with his hobby. David Chen was beaming. Eleanor, your son and daughter-in-law think you're a drain on their resources. They have no idea that you could buy and sell them 10 times over. He started to laugh, a real, genuine laugh that filled the sterile office with warmth. Oh, this is more than good. This is poetic. He leaned forward, all business again, but with a fire in his eye. Here's what we're going to do. First, we set up a new trust in your name immediately. We move all these assets into it. You will be the sole trustee. Second, we open new bank accounts for you, and we close any joint accounts you might have with your son. Third, we get that medical evaluation. I know the best geriatric specialist in the state. She's tough but fair. Fourth, we do nothing. We let them walk into that courtroom thinking you're a helpless old woman with a court-appointed lawyer. We let them build their entire case on that assumption. He paused, a predatory gleam in his eye. And then, at the right moment, we show the judge who you really are. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of quiet activity. I met with Dr. Anya Sharma, the specialist David recommended. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes who put me through a battery of tests for 3 hours. She asked me about my life, my history, the books I was reading. At the end, she smiled. Mrs. Vance, you have the memory of a woman half your age and the wit of a Supreme Court justice. The only thing wrong with your cognition is the audacity of the people who are questioning it. Her report, David told me later, was a work of art. I spent hours with David's paralegals, signing documents, opening accounts. It felt strange, surreal. I, Eleanor Vance, who had used the same worn leather wallet for 30 years, was now the head of a multi-million-dollar trust. But my life didn't change. I still drank my tea from the same chipped mug. I still worked in my garden. I still lived in my small, cozy house. The money wasn't the point. It was the proof. It was the shield. The first counterattack came a week later. The phone rang, and it was Clara. Her voice was like honey laced with arsenic. Eleanor, it's Clara. I was just calling to check on you. Mark and I were so worried when we heard you'd hired a lawyer. One of those big downtown firms. That must be terribly expensive. You're being taken advantage of. I'm fine, Clara, I said, my voice even. Are you sure? Because this is all just a misunderstanding. You're confused. You don't need lawyers. You just need to let us help you. Mark is so upset. He loves you so much. Gaslighting, David had called it, trying to convince me that my reality was wrong. I have to go, Clara. The kettle is boiling. I hung up before she could reply. My hand was perfectly steady. The second escalation was more sinister. I was pruning my roses one afternoon when a car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. A woman in a sensible pantsuit got out. She had a kind, tired face and a briefcase. Mrs. Eleanor Vance? She asked. Yes, my name is Susan Albright. I'm from Adult Protective Services. We received an anonymous report expressing concern for your welfare. My blood ran cold. They had called APS on me. They were trying to build a record to paint me as a victim of neglect who needed saving. I was about to tell her to leave when I remembered David's instructions. Stay calm, be polite, refer them to me. I see, I said, my voice betraying none of the fury I felt. I think you need to speak with my attorney. His name is David Chen. I gave her his card. Ms. Albright looked surprised. You have an attorney? Yes, I said, for this very reason. She took the card, her professional demeanor faltering for a moment. Of course. I'll be in touch with Mr. Chen. She got back in her car and drove away. I called David immediately. He was furious. This is a classic tactic, Eleanor. They're trying to poison the well before the hearing. Don't worry, I'll handle Ms. Albright. Her report will now include the fact that her anonymous tip led her to a woman who is well cared for and has top-tier legal representation. This will backfire on them spectacularly. A few days before the court date, a thick envelope arrived. It was from the court. Inside was a copy of the declaration Mark had been forced to sign. I read his words, how he had observed my increasing forgetfulness, my confusion over finances, my isolation. Each word was a betrayal, a twisting of my love and his weakness into a weapon against me. Clara's declaration was even worse. It was a masterpiece of condescending pity, describing my simple life, my inability to adapt to the modern world, my house that was charming but frankly unsafe. She painted herself as the dutiful, concerned daughter-in-law, forced to take this drastic step for my own good. She mentioned the money, of course, but she framed it as gifts I had insisted on giving, my generosity a symptom of my financial incompetence. I put the papers down. The words stung, but they no longer had the power to wound me deeply. They were just lies on a page. The hearing was in 2 days. It was time. The night before the court date, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows of Robert's study, where I sat in the dark. I couldn't sleep. The house was filled with ghosts, but tonight they were not comforting. I opened the bottom drawer of Robert's desk and pulled out a photo album. I turned the pages until I found it, a picture of Mark, aged 5, at his birthday party. He had a paper crown askew on his head, a smear of chocolate cake on his cheek, and a wide, gap-toothed grin that lit up his whole face. He was pure, uncomplicated joy. I remembered the feel of his small hand in mine, the way he would fall asleep in the car, his head lolling onto my shoulder, the absolute trust in his eyes when he looked at me. This was the boy I had raised. How had he become the man who would sign his name to a document designed to strip me of my home and my dignity? A wave of grief, so powerful it almost knocked the breath from me, washed over my anger. Was I doing the right thing? I was about to go into a courtroom and not just defend myself, but humiliate my own son, to expose his weakness, his greed, his betrayal in a public forum. Could I do that to the little boy with the chocolate on his face? The weight of what I was about to do settled on me, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, a real, terrifying moment, I considered calling David and telling him to stop, to just give them the house, let them have it. What was a house compared to a son? But a house is not just wood and brick, it is the repository of a life. It was the home I had built with the love of my life. It was my independence, my dignity. It was the last piece of myself that they hadn't yet consumed. And then, as if summoned by my doubt, I remembered Clara's voice from the last Christmas dinner. She hadn't known I was in the hallway. She was talking to one of her new wealthy friends, a woman dripping in diamonds. The location is absolutely perfect, Clara had whispered, her voice conspiratorial and sharp. We just have to gut the whole thing, of course. Open it up, modernize it, get rid of all this old stuff. All this old stuff. She was talking about Robert's books, my mother's china, the porch swing, the scratches on the floor. She was talking about my life, my memories. She saw it all as junk to be cleared away to make room for her ambition. And in that moment, my resolve hardened like steel. The grief remained a dull ache beneath my ribs, but the doubt was gone. I was not destroying my son. He and his wife had made their choices. I was simply choosing to survive. I closed the photo album and put it away. I went to my closet and took out the charcoal gray sheath dress I'd owned for 20 years. I had worn it to Robert's retirement party. It was simple, well-made, and timeless. It was my armor. I laid it out for the morning, and then I went to the window and watched the storm. I was no longer afraid of it. I was the storm. The courthouse smelled of floor wax, old paper, and a faint underlying scent of human anxiety. The marble halls echoed with footsteps and hushed, urgent conversations. It was a place of judgment. David met me at the entrance, his presence a calm, reassuring anchor. "You ready, Eleanor?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said. He nodded. "Just remember, say nothing unless I ask you to. Let them have their say. Let them dig their own grave." We entered the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd imagined, paneled in dark wood. Clara and Mark were already there, sitting with their lawyer, a man with a suntan and a suit that looked too expensive for the room. Clara was wearing a sharp, cream-colored power suit, a string of pearls at her throat. She looked confident, composed, every inch the concerned, responsible party. She was whispering animatedly to her lawyer, occasionally gesturing with a perfectly manicured hand. Mark sat beside her, staring straight ahead. He looked pale, his shoulders slumped. He wouldn't look at me. Clara saw us enter. She leaned over and said something to their lawyer. He nodded. She then stood and walked towards me, her face a mask of gentle concern. "Eleanor," she said, her voice loud enough for the few people in the gallery to hear. "There you are. We were so worried. Why don't you come sit in the back with Mark? It's more comfortable, and you won't be so overwhelmed by all of this." She was trying to marginalize me, to physically place me in the role of the frail, confused old woman. Before I could respond, David stepped forward smoothly. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice polite but firm. "But my client will be sitting with me at the counsel table." Clara's smile faltered for just a second. "Of course," she said, recovering quickly. "Whatever is best." She retreated to her side of the room. There it was, the first move in the game. As I sat down next to David, I caught the eye of a uniformed security guard standing by the door. He was an older man with a kind, weary face. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. I remembered what David had told me about letting them dig their own grave. I settled in to wait. "All rise, the bice," the bailiff called out. We stood as a man in a black robe entered from a side door and took his place on the bench. He looked imposing, with a shock of white hair and a stern, deeply lined face. "The Honorable Judge Alistair Finch," Presiding, the bailiff announced. My breath caught in my throat. Alistair Finch. I knew that name. It was a name from the letters, one of Robert's brightest, one of the ones who had written, Juris's work is the foundation of my entire judicial philosophy. I felt David shift beside me. He leaned in and whispered so low I could barely hear it. Well, what a coincidence. The proceedings began. Clara's lawyer, Mr. Hayes, stood up. He was smooth, polished, and deeply condescending. He painted a masterful picture of a beloved family matriarch succumbing to the ravages of time. He used phrases like gentle decline, vulnerable state, and loving family's painful duty. He spoke of my isolation, my refusal of modern conveniences like online banking and cell phones, framing them not as choices but as symptoms of my incompetence. Then he called Mark to the stand. My son walked to the witness box like a man walking to his own execution. He swore the oath, his voice cracking. Mr. Hayes led him through a series of gentle questions. Mr. Vance, you love your mother, don't you? Yes, of course, Mark mumbled, his eyes fixed on his hands. And this petition, it was a difficult decision for you? The most difficult. But you've observed changes in her recently? Forgetfulness? Yes, sometimes. Confusion about money. Has she given you and your wife money over the years? Yes. Significant amounts? Yes. And did this concern you? This unusual generosity? Mark hesitated. I could see the struggle on his face. The truth was a simple, ugly thing. He had asked for the money. But he was under oath and he was trapped. It seemed like she didn't understand the value of it anymore, he finally said, the lie tasting like ash in his own mouth. I felt a stab of pity for him. He was weak, not evil, but his weakness had been the weapon Clara used to wound me. David's cross-examination was short and brutal. Mr. Vance, he began, his voice quiet, you say your mother gave you money. Did you ever ask her for it? Mark flinched. We discussed our needs. Did you ask her for $30,000 for your wedding? It was a loan. Has any of it been repaid? We've been meaning to. Did you ask her for $150,000 for the down payment on your condominium? Mark's face was white. It was an investment in our future. An investment for which she has seen zero return. Did you ask her for $75,000 to start your business? Yes. And $50,000 for your wife's business? Yes. Mr. Vance, David said, his voice dropping even lower. By my count, that's over $250,000. Does that sound like the actions of a woman who is confused about money, or the actions of a mother sacrificing her life savings for her son? Mark put his head in his hands. I don't know, he whispered. No further questions, Your Honor, David said, and sat down. Clara was next. She was a much better witness. She was poised, articulate, and overflowing with false sympathy. She twisted every act of my life into a sign of decay. My love of gardening was obsessive behavior. My simple, frugal life was self-neglect. The money was the act of a woman who needed protecting from her own irrational generosity. She was brilliant. She was hateful. When she was done, Mr. Hayes rested his case. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. We ask that you grant the petition and appoint Mark and Clara Vance as conservators to protect Eleanor Vance from herself. The judge looked at David. Mr. Chin, David stood up. Your Honor, the defense calls no witnesses. A murmur went through the courtroom. Clara and her lawyer exchanged a triumphant look. They thought we had nothing. Instead, David continued, we would like to submit a single document into evidence for the court's eyes only at this time. He walked to the bailiff and handed him a single sealed manila envelope. On it was written, from the estate of Robert Vance. The bailiff carried it to the bench. Judge Finch took it, a flicker of curiosity on his stern face. He broke the seal and slid out the contents. The courtroom was utterly silent. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. I watched the judge's face. He began to read. His expression, at first neutral, began to change. He read Dr. Sharma's scathing report. He read the statement from My New Trust, the number with all its commas. His eyebrows climbed his forehead. But then he got to the last items in the packet. It was a stack of letters, and on top of them a photograph. It was a picture of a much younger Judge Finch standing next to Robert at a law conference 25 years ago. Judge Finch stared at the photograph. Then he slowly lifted his gaze and looked directly at me. His eyes, which had been so stern and impersonal, were now filled with something else entirely. Recognition, awe, and a deep, profound respect. He shuffled the papers until he found a specific letter. It was written in his own hand on university letterhead, dated 30 years prior. He looked from the letter to me. The silence in the room was now thick, heavy, absolute. Clara was looking at her lawyer, confused. Mark was just looking at the floor. Then, slowly, deliberately, Judge Alastair Finch gathered the papers into a neat stack, and he stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. It was a simple, quiet gesture of respect. But in the rigid formality of a courtroom, it was a thunderclap. "Mrs. Vance," he said, and his voice was no longer the voice of a judge. It was the voice of a man speaking to someone he held in the highest esteem. It was thick with an emotion that reverberated through the silent room. "Eleanor Vance, it is an honor to see you in my courtroom, though I wish to God it were under different circumstances." Clara's face, which had been a mask of confident concern, simply collapsed. The color drained from it, leaving it a sickly mottled white. Her mouth fell open. "What?" she breathed, the sound barely audible. Her lawyer was staring, his jaw slack. Judge Finch's eyes turned to them, and the warmth was gone, replaced by an arctic cold. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice like chipping ice, "this petition is not just dismissed, it is an obscenity. It is a fraudulent, predatory attempt to strip a distinguished woman of her assets and her dignity. You and your clients should be ashamed. Narn, dirty, what's a churn?" Just then Mark's phone, which was supposed to be off, buzzed loudly on the table. He fumbled for it, his hands shaking. He looked at the screen. His face, already pale, turned to a shade of gray I had never seen on a living person. He made a small, strangled sound. He showed the phone to Clara. She read the text, and whatever small amount of composure she had left shattered. A single, sharp sob escaped her lips. Their house of cards, built on my money and their lies, had just collapsed. David later found out a high-risk tech stock they had leveraged everything to buy had cratered that morning. They weren't just unsuccessful, they were ruined. The judge slammed his gavel down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "This hearing is over." He looked at me one last time, a look of deep apology in his eyes, and then he swept out of the courtroom. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly strong. David put a hand on my arm. I looked over at my son. Mark was staring at me, his face a ruin of shame and despair. Clara was just weeping, her perfect makeup running down her face. I walked towards them. I stopped in front of Mark. He flinched, expecting anger, expecting recrimination. I looked into his eyes, the eyes of the little boy with the chocolate on his face, now bloodshot and filled with tears. My voice, when it came out, was not the voice of a woman asking permission to exist. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of 82 years. "Your father left you a letter," I said. "He asked me to give it to you when you became a man." I paused, letting the words hang in